first video, but page of the same flowers. I'm going to use a light to medium consistency, so I do want to add quite a good amount of water to the paint. And I want an even coating and a light to medium load on my brush in order to apply the paint without it puddling too much. So for the shapes, just like how we've sketched it out before, I'm going to begin by drawing out the circles depending on where you want each flower to face, and then I add on the triangular shape at the bottom without the petals touching each other. I'm going to follow this up with a thicker consistency of ultramarine while the surface of the petals are still wet. This way the darker blue will naturally bloom out on its own, so there's a nice natural wet on wet gradient. It's not always necessary to wash your brush in between, but I do like to dab off the excess paint sometimes because the lighter blue has a lighter consistency and sometimes the load on my brush is a little bit too wet for the darker blue. But if I feel like the load in my brush is okay, I would just pick up the thick consistency of ultramarine straight from the palette. This is probably one of the tricky things about watercolor, is understanding the load on your brush and how much paint or how wet the paint is on your paper. Whenever I feel uncomfortable placing the load on my brush straight onto the paper, I would just have a scrap paper next to me just to check the load. If what I paint on is puddling wet, then I would just take off the excess paint or the heavy load on my brush and just dab off the excess with the tissue right next to you before trying it again on a scrap piece of paper until you like the color and the load that you have on your brush. So here, as you can see, I started painting the flowers from the center outwards, and I try to space them out so they don't touch each other while the surface of each petals are still wet. That's another thing you should be mindful of if you're fairly new to watercolors, because wherever a wet surface is touching, it's just going to blend into one another. So if you don't want that area to blend, so as an example, if I want to paint a flower right next to this one, it will just blend into one, creating a giant silhouette. This is why I would just space them out so they're not touching. But if you know for sure that a certain flower is completely dry and you want to paint right next to it or even on top of it, it will create a really nice and soft, transparent layering effect. If you have good brush control and you're confident that the flower that you're painting really close together won't blend into one giant puddly mess, you can always do that. But of course, if you're new, I would just recommend for you to space them out and just paint really closely once the previous flowers that you've painted is completely dry. One of the most fun things about watercolors is how dynamic it is, because sometimes it's quite unpredictable where the paint is going to bloom out and mix with each other. Sometimes it can create a mess, like the previous flower that I just painted. I didn't really predict that the darker blue was going to spread out as much. These things always happen, and you can actually fix it by cleaning your brush and then making sure that it's dry. Then you can use your dry brush to pick up the excess paint on your puddly area, and that dry brush will just soak in those excess paint, and then you can dab off the excess on your brush to the tissue, and you can repeat this over and over again until you're quite happy with how the paint spreads out. So here I feel like I have a pretty good amount of flowers, so I'm going to move on to paint the stems and the leaves. I will add on more flowers later on, but I just want to see what it looks like for now with the stems and the leaves, so I don't overcrowd my page. For the green color, I use a mix of crimson with sap green, and I also switch to my small brush. I'm just painting on really tiny stems underneath the petals, and then I'm going to follow this up by painting a wiggly line downwards. And sometimes I like to also connect the flowers together if they're close by. In order for you to create these thin lines, I would suggest for you to use a thick consistency of the color, but with a very light brush load, so the tip of your brush can come to a very fine point. I've actually made a tutorial a while back on how to create thin lines with your watercolor brushes, so hopefully I'll remember to link it in the description box. If I forget though, which I probably will, please just leave a comment asking me about the video so I can link it in the description box, or I can actually send you the link if you're interested. But anyway, getting back to the painting, here I went back to paint on more flowers since I feel like I need to fill in some of these areas. After this though, I'm going to add on the flower buds using the same green mixture, but I'm sticking to my larger brush here. I'm going to paint a few at a time since I am painting a very tiny area or tiny little ovals for the flower buds. This way the paint will have time to settle and somewhat slightly dry, and it won't cause too much puddles. Once I've painted a few of those ovals or clusters for the flower buds, I continued it down with the stems. I'm painting it the same way as how I painted the stems for the flowers, using a thick consistency and a very light brush load. Once the green ovals are more or less dry, I'm going to paint on the light periwinkle blue on top of it. As you can see, if the paint is still a little bit damp, or even if it's dry, it might pull some of the colors and it will mix with the periwinkle blue, but I really don't mind because I quite like the slight shift in color. Just like the flowers before, even after you finish a certain step, you can always go back to add on more flowers or more flower buds until you're satisfied with your composition. I'm quite happy with the amount of flowers and flower buds here, so next I'm going to move on to paint the tiny leaves. For this I used the same green mixture, and as you can see I'm using a fairly light brush load and a medium consistency where I kind of flattened my brush, painting lines diagonally facing the stems on either side of the flowers. That's pretty much it for the first bunch of flowers. You can always adjust the composition according to your liking. Now let's move on to the second flower. This is very similar to the first one, but this time the petals are much longer, and I'm going to do either clusters of 4 petals or 5 petals. When you paint this on, you can use a similar technique by drawing out a circle and then adding a longer triangle underneath all the circles. Personally, I do find it a bit easier to just draw each petals as backwards teardrop shapes, clumping together in the middle. And I also want to make sure that the overall placement of the petals or the overall silhouette of the flower is slightly curved as I've drawn out here, which will help the flower look more natural and flowy. I'm also going to add tiny leaves under the sepals, and as for the flower buds, I just make a circular shape following with the sepals underneath and some easy basic leaf shapes. Just like before, you can draw this out as many times as you would like until you're comfortable with the shapes, but I'm going to move on to paint. For this one, I decided to use gamboge as the main color of the flower, so I'm using gamboge as is in a medium consistency. And on my palette, I also mixed some of the green mix from earlier, which is from crimson and sap green. Since those are the main colors that I'm going to be using for this painting, I do want to mix a fair bit on my palette just for easy access, so I don't have to keep on mixing in between the flowers. As you can see, I'm going to be using these two colors one after the other. I'm not going to wait for the yellow part of the flower to dry. In fact, I'm going to follow it up while it's still wet with the green. Here I'm going to show you what a heavy brush load looks like. As you can see, the tip doesn't come to a fine point, so if that happens, I would just dab off the excess on my tissue. So now the paint and the load of my brush is much more controllable. Now to paint on the flowers, since my brush isn't very pointy, I just put a lot of pressure when I paint the top edges, and I try to take off the pressure as I get towards the bottom so it comes to a finer point. It doesn't need to be so sharp at the bottom since we're going to continue it down with the green color anyway. And you can also mix up the shape and size of the petals, so some petals might be thicker and some might be thinner. And just like the previous flower, in terms of the placement, I like to play around with the size as well as the angle where the flowers are facing. This way, the composition will look a bit more natural and flowy. Sometimes something like this might happen when you try to add on the sepals, and that's because the previous yellow is a bit too puddling wet. So this is why controlling the load on your brush is very, very important. But when that happens, again, just like the previous flower, you can always dab off the excess using tissue or a dry brush. So from here on, I'm just going to continue to paint on more flowers using the same technique until I'm happy with the amount that I have on my paper. And as a tip, if you find it a bit difficult to play around with the angle of the flowers, you can also tilt your paper around, so it's a bit easier painting on the angle that you're comfortable with. The flowers that I've drawn out have a bit of space in between them, but sometimes I do like to paint flowers close together to keep the composition looking more natural and a bit more unpredictable, aren't like a pattern. And if you do want to paint instead, I want to leave a tiny bit of space or maybe just a thin line to connect it to the stem. And this is just one of the tricks to make your painting look a little bit more delicate and less bulky. You don't have to paint on the leaves for every single flower stem. You can just add on the leaves wherever you feel is necessary to fill in the space. Then after that, I'm just going to paint on tiny ones underneath some of the sepals of the flowers. And that's pretty much it for this flower. I'm just going to add one more on the left here to fill in the space. You can always adjust your composition again if you feel you need to add on any of the features. And that's it for the second flower. Now let's move on to the third flower. I'm going to paint something a bit different here. I'm going to make one main stem, and as for the flowers, I'm going to make them grow out at the top as well as the sides of the main stem. And I'm just going to create 3 petaled flowers, getting larger and larger as I get towards the bottom of the stem. Generally, I want the petal in the middle to be a bit larger than the ones on the sides. Then I'm going to continue to the bottom with the sepals, just like how I drew out or painted the first and the second flowers, then continue it down with smaller stems so it all connects together to the main stem. Here I'm just going to draw a larger version of the flower, so in the middle I want teardrop shapes, and for the petals on the sides I try to make them a little bit thinner and also slightly curving towards the middle. For the smaller stems, I want to place them slightly angled and curved, and the flowers can be placed right on either side, or you can also leave space in between to create more of a zigzaggy pattern. And then I'm going to just finish this off with large wavy leaves. For the green of this third flower, I want it to be a bit brighter and more of a yellow green, so I'm adding more gamboge into the green that I already have on my palette. And I'm going to use a thin to medium consistency to paint a couple of main stems using my small brush. For a more dynamic composition, I'm going to cross and curve the stems that I'm going to make, and I made one larger than the other. I want to make the flowers pink for this one, but of course you can also create different hues. And for the pink, I'm going to mix vermilion with white. Just like before, I'm mixing a good amount on my palette for easy access. At the top of the stem, I made the flower really small, and then I continued it down with the green for the sepals to connect to the main stem. Then I'm going to make larger ones as I get to the bottom of the stem. And as you can see, sometimes if the petals are touching each other, it might even look like a 2-petaled flower, but that's completely fine. It doesn't have to look perfect. For this one, I'm not exactly looking to separate each petal like how I've painted the first and the second flower. Instead, I want this to be clusters, but I do want to have a bit more space in between the petals for the larger flowers. As you can see, I'm not really bothered with the stem that's connecting the sepals and the main stem together at this point. I just want to make sure that the sepals are painted on while the surface of the pink flowers are still wet to create a wet on wet effect. Once I'm very close to touching the second stem, I'm going to paint on the flowers on the empty stem and basically do the same thing for this one. Just like the